Good evening. I'm Leland Vittert. Rarely do we learn anything from congressional hearings. Today is an exception. The DHS Secretary proved, and by extension proved, that the administration he represents is either willfully ignorant or intentionally ignoring the reality on our southern border. And there is no solution in sight. First, the facts, and they are undisputed. In fact, many come from the Biden administration itself. Last month, DHS reported they encountered 164,000 people. That's down from September, which could seem like good news, but up 128% from last October. Month to month, up 128%. So far this year, 3 times as many people have come across the border than last year, for a total of 1,679,000. That's a little more than the population of Philadelphia and a little less than the population of Phoenix. Here's one of the many fiery exchanges between Texas Senator Ted Cruz and the Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas.
True or false, Secretary Mayorkas? This year, under Joe Biden, we've seen the highest rate of illegal immigration in 61 years.
Again, I don't know the number of years, but it's certainly a historic high, Senator.
So you're right, it's broken, but you broke it.
14% of Americans say immigration is the single most important issue facing the country. That's above climate change and national security, below COVID and the economy as the most important. That's the latest poll from CNN. Republicans hold a 27-point advantage on who will deal best with border security, 48-21. And the American people are taking note in a larger sense. It factors into President Biden's approval rating that's hit a new all-time low. The Real Clear Politics average of polls puts his approval at 41.9. 52.7% of the country disapprove. And the situation is getting worse on the southern border. Migrants we talked to on both sides of the border say President Biden's policies and campaign promises are why they decided to come. Senator Kennedy of Louisiana today pointed that out.
He supported amnesty for the 11.7 million people in our country illegally. He promised he would end the Remain in Mexico program. He promised he would end the safe third country agreements. He promised he would get rid of the border wall. He promised to encourage sanctuary cities, and he said, I'm not going to deport people. Can we agree that you don't have to be Mensa material to understand that's an open border policy?
Well, for what it's worth, that's exactly what the Texas Rangers and Highway Patrol tell us. They are now standing guard on the border. We were down there with them, because the Border Patrol is overwhelmed with folks. It's getting a lot worse. Here's Lieutenant Chris Oliveris on the program last night.
The messaging from day one from the federal government was to come to the U.S., that you will be released into the country. And they've seen that firsthand with families and friends that have come across that make that journey and get released into the country.
Remember, for each one of those 1.6 million that was caught, number of those were released in the hundreds of thousands, and hundreds of thousands, if not at least 1 million more, got away without the Border Patrol or Customs and Border Protection or the Texas Department of Public Safety catching them. They're now somewhere in the United States. In fairness, the Trump administration didn't solve the problem either. Their plan of building a giant wall mostly failed, not because the wall didn't work, but because it wasn't built. Of the roughly 2,000 miles of border, the Trump administration built 80 miles worth of new wall, reinforced roughly 400 miles of old wall. That's about a quarter, a little less than a quarter of the border where you can build a wall. Fulfilling another campaign promise, the Biden administration stopped construction on that wall in January. Noteworthy that of the massive $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill that President Biden created and celebrated with a trip today to New Hampshire, there's tens of billions of dollars for the bridges, like the one you just see there that he walked across. $5 billion for alternatively fueled school buses to drive across the new bridges, a whopping $66 billion for Amtrak to build new train tracks, but $0 to reinforce or secure the unguarded part of the border. We're going to get to Mr. Biden's trip in a few minutes as we continue, but we're going to move back down to the border. Mayorkas played defense on a few levels, including over the kids in cages talking point. Turns out the Biden administration, like the Trump administration, like the Obama administration, put kids in cages as well.
It's a simple question. How many children have been in those cages?
I respectfully am not familiar with the term cages and to what you are referring. There are
enclosures in which they are locked in which I took photographs and put them out because you blocked the press and didn't want people to see the Biden cages.
Senator Cruz had some photographs that he showed. Today's hearing appeared to be an acute but severe case of cage amnesia. After all, Mayorkas knew all about the cages less than a year ago at his confirmation hearing.
It is true that the Obama administration built the facility in McAllen, Texas, correct?
Yes, sir.
And that's the same facility that has the chain link fences that people on the other side of the aisle have referred to as putting children in cages, correct?
Yes, sir.
You continued. You detained individuals, correct? Correct?
We detained individuals as part of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement operation.
Reasonable people can disagree on immigration policy. Should America let in 1 million or 5 million? Should America have a lottery system or prioritize those with certain highly skilled jobs? Should people already here get legal status or not? Another debate. Should we prioritize people who have economic hardship in addition to those escaping genocide? All debates to have, but the Biden administration, before being able to have those debates, faces a new problem. Even if they want to send people back, they can't.
It is because we are implementing the court's order in good faith. We are working with Mexico. It requires a bilateral relationship and an agreement.
Axios reports other countries, in addition to Mexico, aren't playing ball. Biden's new border problem, they write, nations won't take migrants back. An unprecedented number of migrant adults are coming from countries that make deportation difficult: Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Brazil. Axios reports it's gotten so bad and the holding facilities are so overcrowded that on Sunday alone, one day, 800 migrants from South America, Africa, and other far-off lands were released into the United States. Again, reasonable people can agree. Before solving the long-term policy questions as outlined above, we could perhaps agree to stop making the problem worse by encouraging record numbers to come and letting them through. But no, at that, primary dysfunction is where we start with NewsNation's Kellie Meyer, who was at the hearing today and joins us now from Capitol Hill. Good evening, Kellie.
Good evening, Leland. Well, one GOP senator told reporters he wanted to ask the secretary, quote, whether he was incompetent or he believes in open borders. Republicans grilled the secretary today over many issues, including releasing migrants who tested positive for COVID-19, as well as those who have committed crimes. Democrats turned this around and slammed the previous administration for their policies. They defended that Biden isn't solely to blame. Here's two senators from earlier today.
I don't think you're calling the shots. I think those shots are being called out of the White House. I think they ought to be here.
And the fact is the Biden administration was handed a system decimated by the previous administration.
And Republicans and Democrats, while they disagreed on who's to blame, they did agree that the immigration system is broken and are calling, at least Democrats are calling, for an immigration reform on Capitol Hill. And Mayorkas also pointing the finger to Congress to pass immigration reform, saying that it is needed to fix the problem at the border. Leland?
That'd be a start. All right, Kellie, thank you very much. Americans have long supported the idea of immigration reform. It goes all the way back to George W. Bush. Obviously, Ronald Reagan gave amnesty. But reasonably, most Americans feel the situation is getting worse. That's because it is. A Pew Research poll finds 65% believe President Biden's policies encourage illegal immigration. But at the same time, an NPR poll finds a majority of Americans support a pathway to citizenship, especially for asylum seekers and dreamers, people who were brought here as kids illegally. And immigration isn't just an issue on our southern border. This is new video of the migrant crisis happening at the border between Belarus and Poland. It shows us what people worldwide are in search of a better life are willing to do to make a dangerous journey to find a better life. Of course, the Polish border is a little different than the U.S. border. Chad Wolf knows firsthand the challenge of fixing our immigration system, former acting DHS Secretary who joins us now. I don't know about you because you have a little different view. I almost felt bad for Secretary Mayorkas in that hearing a little bit just because of what he had to defend.
Well, I think it's difficult for him to defend because a lot of the positions are indefensible. At the end of the day, I think you're right, Leland, as you said in the monologue, is that I think we all want a functioning immigration system. And so the question is, how do you do that? But you first have to secure the border. You first have to stop the hundreds of thousands of folks coming across that border illegally and being released into the United States. You cannot talk about immigration reform without first securing that border. And what we've seen from the administration over the course of 9 or 10 months now is that they have no plan to secure that border. There's nothing in the works that's going to have this situation get better and better over time. And so I think that's the dilemma that we're in. If we can all agree to secure the border first, then you can start talking about other immigration reforms that you need to do, that Congress needs to step up and to do themselves.
You say we have to first secure the border. The argument from Democrats is we'll do it all together. Comprehensive immigration reform. And I see you're shaking your head. Why won't that work?
It just simply won't work. I think we've seen it in the past. And most Democrats, when you look at an immigration reform bill, and there's been one put forth by the administration earlier this year, it was 2,000 pages, and I think about 4 pages were on security. And so you can't talk about fixing the root causes of migration, or you can't talk about amnesty. You can't talk about a number of things if that border is going to continue to be wide open, because it doesn't matter what provisions or immigration statutes that you pass. If people can still enter the country illegally, then it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you do. So at the end of the day, you have to enforce the laws that are on the books. That takes leadership, and it's leadership that's lacking in this administration right now.
Yeah, you make a very good point in terms of if you have immigration reform, which gives people a path to citizenship or amnesty or registry or whatever it is, and haven't secured the border, then more people hear about that, see that, and rush to the border, which is still unsecured. I'm interested in sort of how this works, and you've got a unique perspective because oftentimes as the secretary, you're just following orders. Here was Senator Kennedy talking about Mayorkas' job, and we'll get your reaction on the other side.
I don't think you deserve to have to be here today to answer questions about immigration, because I don't think you're calling the shots. I think those shots are being called out of the White House. I think they ought to be here.
And the secretary fell on his sword. He said, I'm proud of the work we're doing. I'm not sure what there is to be proud of, but he said it. Is Kennedy right, though, that the White House is calling these shots?
Well, I think there's always some direction from the White House to every executive department under their purview. And DHS is not excluded from that. So I'm sure that DHS is certainly getting some insights, direction, recommendations, whatever you want to call it, from the White House. So absolutely, these are not decisions alone that DHS is making. But at the end of the day, what is most disconcerting is that DHS and the secretary and others there, the leadership, seem to be going against advice from career professionals, whether they're at ICE, whether they're at the Border Patrol or elsewhere, because these folks know what programs and policies work and which ones don't work. And they're giving that advice to the DHS leadership, and they seem to not be taking it. They seem to be making political decisions to achieve a political purpose. And I think in a department like Homeland Security, when you're talking about the security of Americans and American communities along that southwest border, that is very dangerous.
Yeah, we're
so
seeing
that's
pictures
to certainly be concerned about.
Yeah, we're seeing pictures of some of the gang members. There were 500 sexual predators caught so far this year. Those are the ones that caught, not the ones that got away. So we're seeing a number of pictures there of the people that those communities face. Hey, Chad, it's always great to see you. We really appreciate the insights.
All right, thanks, Heather.
Yeah, the secretary made an unusual argument today. The way to keep people from coming is to give those here, as we just discussed with Chad, amnesty.
If, in fact, we can pass legislation that fixes once and for all our immigration system, we will have addressed in a material part the challenges at our border.
Perhaps it would fix the challenges by encouraging so many more to come that Border Patrol would just give up. The cartels would take over South Texas, including amnesty or some form of it. Is priority one among progressives for the Build Back Better spending plan. When it comes to Capitol Hill, few people are better sourced than Pablo Manriquez, reporter for the Latino Rebels, has been spot on with his reporting on the progressive cause all the way through from the infrastructure plan to the Build Back Better plan we're here now. Pablo, how much of this idea of amnesty, registry, some form of legal status for illegal immigrants is a dream of the Progressive Caucus, and what's versus the chance of it actually happening?
I mean, the chances of it actually happening in some sort of piecemeal form are narrowing. There's basically what amounts to a legislative keyhole of opportunity for some green card provisions that would put people who are these sort of like tech workers and doctors and things like that who come here largely from India and China on a pathway to citizenship through by basically recapturing old green cards that were approved by Congress, but were never actually used, and applying them to existing green card claims. But in terms of like the mass amnesty that I think some Republicans have been talking about, it doesn't even exist in the Build Back Better Act bill, which is a testament to the weakness of progressives at the negotiating table on specifically immigration. They went into the negotiating with immigration as one of their 5 negotiating priorities for the bill. And while there are immigrant relief provisions that remain in the bill, the ones that most progressive organizations, especially at the grassroots level who are invested in immigration reform, wanted are out, including registry, as you say, which would be like a Reagan amnesty 2.0.
Yeah, I guess
that would move the registry date for him. Yeah.
What I'm interested in is about this bill, because you think that there is a bipartisan desire to get this done. You've reported on it. I've reported on it. What is so difficult for Democrats to get past of actually securing the border? Because if you offered amnesty for 11 million illegal immigrants tomorrow, but said in exchange there has to be an impenetrable wall on the southern border, I think there's probably a lot of the progressive caucus that wouldn't make that deal.
Oh my God, Leland. So actually, while you were doing your monologue, I was having the exact same thought in my head. I was like, why not start asking these senators? Because I actually spoke with Senator Cornyn today from Texas. And I said, basically, like, if Democrats drop the ball on citizenship again, does that create an opportunity for Republicans, a political opportunity, an electoral opportunity for Republicans in immigrant communities? But as you were saying your monologue, I was like, wow, it does occur to me that the deal kind of is an amnesty for a wall. If Democrats are willing to accept a wall, are Republicans willing to accept an amnesty? Now, what Chad Wolf said and what Senator Cornyn both said, and they agree, is that border security needs to come first. But unfortunately, from a negotiating position, if border security has to come first, it allows for the goalposts to continuously be moved, because you can define border security a million different ways, and the border can always be more secure, right?
No,
so the question is, like, at what threshold is an amnesty worth it to Republicans
so
that they can
works
go
on the other side, though, right? For Democrats, who they can keep sort of holding out for pathway to citizenship or citizenship for everybody or some kind of registry. Meantime, there's just more and more people coming across. So keeping the open border, which I think reasonable people can agree we have right now, still works for them and for their constituents.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those tough situations where Republicans are never going to be able to close the border. Like, I think that to say that, like, no immigrants are going to be able to come here unauthorized underestimates the resiliency of a lot of the people that are trying to cross. Like, there are always going to be people who get across unnoticed, right? There are always going to be people who get apprehended at the border. What we do with them systemically is something that, because the politics of immigration is always so sort of like, let's go to the simplest possible, like, talking point, or the simplest possible solution, like immigrants bad or immigrants dangerous or immigrants amazing, immigrants, like, worthy. It's never been simplified down to something as basic as registry for a wall or amnesty for a wall. Yeah. So maybe that is the problem. Maybe we just made a breakthrough on this tonight, Leland, because honestly, that is a deal that no one ever gets asked about.
Favor.
But it does seem pretty obvious in retrospect.
Do me a favor. This issue's not going away. Sometime, just do a little poll on camera with a couple of Democratic senators, a couple of Republicans, a couple in the Progressive Caucus. Citizenship for a wall. Would you take the deal or not? And get back to us, all right? Well, good. Thanks for your time.
Sounds good, Leland.
Yeah, it was great seeing you. Good conversation. All right, the jury is in deliberations on the fate of Kyle Rittenhouse. We'll tell you about the threats being made by BLM and Antifa if he gets off. And while some places are letting up on COVID mandates, others are ramping up. Is it time to finally declare this over and let everybody live their life? Welcome back. Today, Washington, D.C., of all places, announced they're giving up on managing COVID cases to zero and dropping their mask mandate. Pretty incredible for Muriel Bowser to do that. As we've reported, it comes amid great news on the pandemic. A healthy, vaccinated American, well, they are highly, highly, highly unlikely to die from the pandemic. As we noted last week, 3 times as many people die from being hit by a car, pedestrians hit by a car, than vaccinated people have died of COVID. And that counts people like Colin Powell, vaccinated but with other terrible health conditions. For the unvaccinated, there's great news as well. This week, the Biden administration announced it's buying 10 million doses of Pfizer's COVID pill, which proved nearly 100% effective for the unvaccinated who get COVID to keep them from dying. The top of Drudge Report tonight, though, Biden to require booster, ? Will it ever end? You might remember we asked that same question last week. Would someone please blow the whistle so we can all move on with our lives? Congressman Mark Green, emergency room physician, former Army flight surgeon, is ready to do just that. All right, why are we all ready to get back to normal now?
Well, I think the 18 months of this, or well, more than that now, has really worn down the economy. The longer we keep this sort of pandemic phase, the more risk we put patients who aren't getting their cancer checkups and things like that. Breast exams and colonoscopies are still at 2/3 the pre-pandemic level. And that's people who will die from cancer because of a late diagnosis. So it's time to move from the pandemic to the endemic phase of this thing.
It may be time, and I understand that. We just got a headline now from Bloomberg. Case counts way up with COVID, explosions in certain states of cases. Should we really care about cases anymore of COVID if effectively a healthy person's not going to die from it?
You know, when you start looking at the criteria to move from pandemic to endemic, one of the things you want to look at is the trend line between hospitalizations and death and the actual case numbers. And what we're already seeing is those trends are now diverging. And it's because we have so many people, 79% of Americans have at least one shot, and over 100 million cases. So we're rapidly approaching the point where this thing should go from pandemic to endemic. And that's why we're sending both the CDC and the president a letter asking him to come up with the plan to end this thing.
You'd think that the CDC and the president would be chomping at the bit to end this thing. It does not appear that way. Do you have an answer why?
Well, of course, there's suspicions that prolonging it empowers a certain party. There's some political advantages to continuing it. Those suspicions are clearly there. Obviously, we want it over. We want it ended. Get back to our normal lives.
Yeah, you think the other argument, I had a radio talk show host on, or I was on with him a couple of hours ago, and I sort of laid this thesis out that you and I are talking about. He said, oh no, we must keep wearing masks. He wasn't kidding. We must keep wearing masks, and there must be more mandates because of the immunocompromised that a healthy person carrying COVID could infect.
Well, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. We've had immunocompromised people around for a very long time, and the flu is just as devastating to immunocompromised people. Other, infectious diseases they're susceptible to those. So this notion that COVID, especially with people being vaccinated, et cetera, it just doesn't make any scientific sense at all.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to what George Will was saying last week, that there's a certain group of people who enjoy the sense of emergency, and then there's people who enjoy the power who comes from the sense of emergency. Congressman, when you send that letter, come back and talk to us about it. I know you'll have some interesting statistics in it, all right?
Will do, Leland.
Yeah, thank you, sir. We appreciate it. The harshest thing we are hearing about China is coming from a Turkish NBA player. Why isn't the President of the United States calling out Xi Jinping? And we're still awaiting a verdict in the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. Back to Kenosha, Wisconsin, where the BLM protesters are quite vocal about what they want when we come back. Some pleasant people there. Tensions high in Kenosha, Wisconsin, as the verdict in the Kyle Rittenhouse murder trial could be coming tomorrow. The jury's gone home for the day after it began deliberations in the case of that 18-year-old who was 17 at the time that he fatally shot two men and injured a third during the riots in Kenosha last August. It was a BLM Antifa riot in Kenosha that sparked the Rittenhouse shooting, and now BLM is threatening chaos if Rittenhouse is acquitted. Antifa's there as well. NewsNation correspondent Kellie Beeson live tonight in Kenosha, where at least some of the protesters have gone home. Hi, Kellie.
Hey, good evening, Leland. Well, that's right. The governor here is saying that there are 500 National Guard troops, you may remember, that are on standby, ready to report to Kenosha if needed. Also, Chicago police officers have had their days off canceled. Now, you remember last year, you mentioned it a little bit, that there were BLM protests here in the streets of Kenosha that did lead to some property destruction, and some holding BLM signs outside of the courthouse saying there could be similar scenes if a not guilty verdict is returned. Now, as we await a verdict in this case, some businesses have been boarded up. But we just learned moments ago that the jury was released for the evening, and so the crowds out here have dissipated. Leland?
Yeah, they were chanting all day today during the deliberations. Kellie, thanks so much. We'll check in with you tomorrow. We appreciate it. As we await the jury's decision, we bring in Phillip Turner, longtime federal prosecutor, now defense attorney, joining us from Phoenix. Counselor, good to see you.
Nice seeing you.
I mean, now you just got to read the tea leaves, right? What do you make of the jury being out for all day?
I think they're considering everything very seriously, which is what they're supposed to do. I did not expect a quick verdict in this case, and I think we're going to see some lengthy deliberations.
I'm taken back to the closing arguments, which ended up being sort of this really personal, vindictive, angry rant by the prosecutors at Kyle Rittenhouse, and at the same time sort of whitewashing the people who were shot in their actions. One guy's a pedophile who then, this is how the prosecutor described his actions that night. Take a listen.
Oh, and he said some bad words. He said the N-word.
Boy, if you were a defense attorney, you'd have to be smiling when you saw the prosecutor do that.
Well, absolutely. And I know the prosecutor also said that the defendant had inserted himself into the situation. Well, the same could be said for these people who were shot, and also for the other person who was injured but didn't die. I mean, they inserted themselves into this situation also. As I understand it, one of the people had mental health issues, which came out, and had not taken his medication, which I think fortified the self-defense aspect of this, because someone would act irrationally under those circumstances. But certainly what the prosecutor said was helpful to the defense, quite frankly.
Yeah, it feels like a lot of things. I want to point out the video, and I don't know if you're able to see the video that we're seeing, but it's of Kyle Rittenhouse pulling names or numbers out of a tumbler in which he selected his own jury. I've never seen that. In your time behind in the law, have you ever?
No, I think that's the selection of the alternates. And usually it's done by the judge, or at least a court personnel. I've never seen the defendant do it in the case, but it really doesn't matter, quite frankly. He's just pulling out things at random now.
Fair enough.
Obviously there's two arguments could be made here. One is, well, why is he allowed to do that? Well, he can't rig anything. And the other thing is, you could say, well, this gives the defendant a complete fair trial because he's able to do the random selection of the alternates.
Yeah, a jury of his peers picked by him. Hey, Counselor, we appreciate it. Thank you. We'll check in with you throughout the week.
You're welcome.
Yeah, see you soon.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye. As Kenosha, Wisconsin, and much of the nation is watching for the Rittenhouse verdict, the media has been accused of rushing to judgment and stoking divisions ahead of the verdict. And now the question is, are viewers really getting the full story? MSNBC reportedly did not air the defense team's closing arguments, but did air the prosecutor's case to the jury. CNN also skipped the first hour of the defense's closing arguments. Colby Hall, founding editor of Mediaite and NewsNation producer, joins us now. Boy, Colby, I understand decisions made in control rooms, but you have to think to exclude an entire side of a really controversial trial just feels biased, for lack of a better word.
Well, biased is a word. I would say stilted is another word. I mean, I think, candidly, the way that the trial went was surprising to a lot of people, in large part because there was a sort of, I mean, you said prejudice. It was prejudged from when the events happened in August, which, remember, was a very raw time in our nation's history, and it followed the shooting of Jacob Blake. But there was a rush to judgment there, so there was this presumption that this was going to be fireworks and that Rittenhouse was going to be found guilty and come off as sort of an entitled jerk, when in fact he was incredibly well prepared and remarkably sort of calm, apart from an emotional breakdown. And so I think the CNN or the programmers at these networks decided that it wasn't really, you know, if there's a bias at these networks, it's towards conflict, and there was less conflict or surprise, and that's really why they pulled out.
It's an interesting analysis of that. There was a group, though, that seemed terribly disappointed that the trial did not follow the pre-built narrative that they had in their mind and that they talked about, of a white supremacist who went there to shoot people because he was angry and racist and the like. This is Whoopi Goldberg along those lines. Take a listen.
I think it's really a red light for white folks coming to help at social justice protests, because basically what they're saying is, oh, it's okay to shoot white people too.
I think an acquittal would say it's okay to shoot people who point guns at you or are beating you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm reminded of something my father used to tell me when I told him what I thought about something. He said, opinions are like a certain part of the body and that everyone has one. and candidly, I think that's what, you know, Whoopi's throwing some stuff out there. Because again, she's giving analysis to her viewers and to her audience. And of course, that's not what this message sent. This is not an okay to shoot white people or anyone for that matter, and to simplify a really complicated and complex situation from which there's tons of moving parts to that sort of soundbite is just irresponsible, and it's unhelpful. It doesn't help where we are as a nation.
Yeah, it does seem to cross the line from simply a misguided opinion to actually kind of irresponsible if you're giving people that idea. I got 30 seconds, but I wanted to get you on this. Thomas Binger, who may not have a great career ahead of him as a prosecutor, considering how badly he botched this case. We have an idea of where he might end up next. If we put that up, next job, CNN or MSNBC legal analyst?
I don't think that he's going to get either one, but it's a funny idea. I suspect he'll get like Wisconsin's local version of Dancing with the Stars, because he's not ready for national prime time. And, you know, ultimately that poor dude, his career is in shambles, but we'll see where he ends up. I think the judge.
Dancing with the Stars worked out really well for Sean Spicer. Don't knock it. Colby, we'll see you soon. Right. You got a show to prepare for. We'll talk to you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Russian building up their military forces at the Ukraine border. Does that mean it's time to commit American troops as a treaty requires? When we come back. President Biden last night during his virtual summit with the Chinese president. We have some video of the two of them together. There's Xi Jinping, a communist strongman who currently presides over one of the worst genocides since the Nazis. I don't say that lightly, but President Biden won't say it. In fact, he didn't say it at all last night, nor did he confront the Chinese on all that much of their bad behavior. FDR also didn't say much about the Holocaust and Nazis' atrocities till well into World War II. History did not judge him well for that. The lack of moral courage is clear, especially compared to that of Enes Kanter. He's a basketball player. I'd never heard of him, but he does know a thing or two about totalitarian regimes. He came from Turkey and recently tweeted his shoes reading "Stop Organ Harvesting in China" and calling on China to stop murdering for organs, calling it a crime against humanity. He's also been vocal in the need to support Taiwan, currently stronger words than we have ever heard from the president. Robert Wilkie, former Veteran Affairs Secretary, Undersecretary of Defense in the last administration, joins us now. Boy, in one way, it's kind of, you have to feel good that we're now seeing pro sports people that we can look up to again. At the same time, really, that's where our moral courage has to come from?
Well, and it's shocking that it's coming from the NBA, which has spent the last decade doing everything it can to make sure that Xi's money flows into its coffers. And while it hosted many anti-American events, it said nothing about its connections with the most murderous regime in history. And this young man from the Boston Celtics has not only spoken out against the Erdogan fanaticism in Turkey, but he's done the same thing with the Chinese and really put the NBA leadership to shame.
When the Chinese see that, do they care, or do they simply care that President Biden's rolling over because he wants a climate deal?
Well, they do care. They care about face, and they care about making sure they can manage every aspect of their relationships with the rest of the world and how the rest of the world sees them. So they do care about those things, which is why they were actually worried to some extent that Biden would talk about the Olympics, but of course he did not do that because that is the ultimate event to put Chinese communism on the world stage.
You've got what's happening with China right now. The person who's watching China probably even more closely than a lot of our allies, say in Europe, is Vladimir Putin in Russia, who's watching what we're doing with China in Taiwan. Vladimir Putin is now once again threatening to invade eastern Ukraine. He sort of did it back in 2014. I was there. We have a map showing what happened. This is what Putin said at the time. I'd like to remind you that what was called Novaya Russia, New Russia, back in the Tsarist days, these territories were given to Ukraine in the 1920s. Why? Who knows? There's not much in eastern Ukraine other than some coal fields, which Putin controls anyway. Does he really want to invade Ukraine, or does he just want to embarrass the United States?
Well, I think he just wants to embarrass the United States, but he's also sending a message to this administration that he has its number. I'll give you an example. Biden provided the Ukrainians with meals ready to eat and coats, and Putin advanced. President Trump reversed that. Instead of meals ready to eat, he filled Ukraine with missiles that could take out Putin's planes and tanks, and Putin stopped. And then as soon as Biden got in, the meals ready to eat went back. So Putin is flexing his muscles. He wants not only to intimidate Ukrainians, he wants to intimidate Eastern Europeans, for instance, the Poles, who have been most receptive to a new American presence on their soil, on the borders of the Russian state. So he's playing the long game, three-dimensional chess, and Biden's playing checkers.
Yeah. Real quick on that, here was Vice President Harris talking about Ukraine. Take a listen.
Are you saying that Russia is heeding the U.S. warnings to back off of Ukraine?
I cannot talk to you about classified information, but we, of course, remain very concerned about what's happening there.
What a stunningly weak answer.
That is a very weak answer, because the answer doesn't require any divulging of classified information. You're either supporting a free people's to stand up to intimidation, or you don't. And given what has happened with this administration since January, and more importantly with the debacle in Afghanistan, where Moscow was taking notes, it's not surprising that you get an answer like that.
Yeah, bring it back full circle. We know from our reporting that Xi and the communists in China were also emboldened by what happened in Afghanistan. Mr. Secretary, we appreciate your time, sir. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Leland.
Yeah, no, great conversation. A former Democratic Treasury Secretary is now warning his party that inflation will lead to their worst nightmare, another Trump presidency. Is it possible? When we come back.
Nobel laureates in economics said it'll actually bring down the cost. It will reduce the deficit, and it will totally paid for, and it's going to reduce inflation.
Dare to dream. Perhaps somebody said that. I've not met a lot of economists who actually believe that. President Biden says his new plan is going to decrease inflation. But is that true? We'll see. Americans' wallets are certainly feeling the squeeze right now. The rate of inflation from October 20 to 21 is 6.2%. Food and rent account for more than half of the rise of the consumer price index, and economists expect rents to be a major source of inflation in the months ahead. The cost of a new vehicle rose 1.3%. with the average price coming in at $45,000. Used cars up double digits, food up double digits. President Bill Clinton's Treasury Secretary, Lawrence Summers, had a warning. I believe the Biden administration and the Federal Reserve need to further adjust their thinking on inflation today. The Fed should signal that the primary risk is overheating and accelerate tapering of its asset purchases. Joining us now, Batya Ungar-Sargon, Deputy Opinion Editor of Newsweek. The warning went on that not paying attention to inflation would bring back a Trump presidency. Is it sort of speaking to this issue that there's so many people in the Democratic Party who care more about the policies than they do about the people, and inflation is this abstract concept to them?
You know, there was a time when the Democrats' base was really the working class. It was labor, right? It was people who feel inflation in their pocketbooks immediately and cannot afford a 6% increase in their groceries and a 50% increase in gas. And what we've seen recently, you know, over the last 40 years, over the last 20 years, and increasingly over the last 10 and 5 years is the Democrats' new base right now is really the college-educated voter. And those are people who really, maybe they don't feel inflation as strongly. We really do live in America, two Americas, right? There's the people who are feeling inflation very deeply and the people who can actually afford it, right? Who maybe managed to stock up a lot of money by not going out to eat during the pandemic, who own homes and their homes are worth more, right? People who have savings now because of the pandemic. And then in America that is still struggling. And it's just sort of heartbreaking to see that the Democrats are leaning in so deeply to the people who are not struggling and really abandoning those people who are feeling that inflation.
Yeah, it does, especially in the media world. And we're in Chicago, so you do get a little bit more sense of real people than the media groups that live on the East Coast, especially in New York. This was Stephanie Ruhle of MSNBC, kind of along those lines.
Why is it that we're not seeing the Fed raise rates and end bond purchases? It doesn't make sense why we are still at the levels we're at. We haven't seen inflation like this since the 90s, and that's when Fed funds rate was above 5%. Why on earth would we still be at zero and buying bonds?
Well, I think you know my answer to that question, which is we have a lot of respect for the independence of the Fed, and so you're not going to hear me or the president. Well, you're not going to hear me or the president pass judgment on the Fed's execution of monetary policy. It's important to maintain the independence there.
Willie, while nobody likes to pay more, on average, we have the money to do so.
I guess she has the money to do so.
Yeah, it's so funny. In that clip, she said, you know, the dirty secret is what she called it. The dirty secret is that Americans don't like inflation, but they can afford it. And honestly, Leland, the dirty secret is that journalism is produced by the people who can afford it, for the people who can afford it, at the expense of everybody else who are sitting there wondering if they're going to be able to afford Thanksgiving and Christmas.
Does this ever translate to the ballot box in a way, or I should say, does this translate in a way that will change policies before it translates to the ballot box?
You know, Leland, the number one reason people gave for voting for Glenn Youngkin was the economy, right?
Well, that in schools.
Voters tend to blame the... And schools came in at a close second, that the day of the election sort of outpaced the economy. But the economy for most of the election was the number one reason. Yeah. And, you know, voters don't like inflation and they tend to blame the party that's in power. But I really
Batya,
think
I gotta run. Just ask Jimmy Carter the famous question, are you better off 4 years ago than you are today? We got to run. Dan Abrams is next. Thanks for watching. Click the red subscribe button below so you can get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.